There is a mass buried under the ice of East Antarctica that should not be there. It is roughly 300 miles across. It is denser than the rock around it. It bends the gravity of the planet enough that satellites in orbit can feel it pulling at them from 400 miles up. And for years, the people who found it could not tell you what it was. Not a mountain, not an ordinary basin. A dense, buried object, ring-shaped, sitting under almost a mile of solid ice in one of the most restricted places on Earth. NASA's own satellites detected it. And the first scientist to study the raw numbers said something that most researchers never say out loud. He said the signal looked like what you would expect from a giant metallic mass sunk deep below the surface, hidden from every eye except the ones we put in space. Most people have never heard of it. It doesn't appear on the tourist maps. There are no photographs because no human has ever seen it. It exists only as a shadow in the planet's gravity field, a distortion so large you could drop an entire American state into it. And the more instruments we point at that patch of ice, the stranger the readings get. This is the story of what is under there. It is a story with three pieces: a gravity anomaly the size of a country, a continent locked down by treaty and patrolled by military aircraft, and a lost expedition, the largest military force ever sent to the bottom of the world, that came home early, quietly, and never fully explained why. Each piece has an ordinary explanation, and each ordinary explanation has a hole in it. Keep watching, because the third piece is the one that turns a scientific curiosity into something a lot of people would rather you didn't look at. Start with the anomaly because it's real and it's documented, and you can look up the paper yourself. In 2006, a team led by a geophysicist named Ralph von Fries at Ohio State University was working with data from a pair of NASA satellites called GRACE. GRACE didn't take pictures. It measured gravity. Two spacecraft chasing each other in orbit, and whenever they passed over something heavy, the lead craft would speed up a fraction, and that tiny change revealed the mass hidden below. It was a way of X-raying the planet through miles of rock and ice. When von Fries's team mapped Wilkes Land in the eastern half of Antarctica, they found something enormous: a positive gravity spike, a concentration of extra mass sitting right in the center of a ring-shaped structure buried in the bedrock. The mass concentration alone was about 300 kilometers wide. The ring around it stretched close to 500, centered at 70 degrees south, 120 degrees east, under roughly a mile of ice. The mainstream reading came fast, and it is genuinely fascinating on its own. They proposed it was an impact crater, not a small one. If they were right, it would be the largest impact structure ever found on Earth, more than twice the width of Chicxulub, the crater in Mexico that is blamed for killing the dinosaurs. A rock from space, big enough to end a world, buried and forgotten under the ice at the bottom of the planet. But that explanation has a problem. And the problem is that nobody has ever confirmed it. Here's what a confirmed impact crater requires: physical proof, shocked quartz, minerals deformed by the shock of impact, impact glass, rock melted and flash cooled. You drill down, you pull a core, you look at the grains under a microscope, and the rock tells you whether something hit it. That has never been done at Wilkes Land. Not once. The site sits under a mile of ice in a place where drilling to bedrock would cost a fortune and take years of permits. So, the largest impact crater on Earth remains, officially, a hypothesis. A shape in the gravity data that could be an impact, could be a volcanic feature, could be an ancient buried basin, or could be something we don't have a category for yet. And that is the pattern you're going to see again and again in this story. Every time an instrument reaches into Antarctica and finds something that doesn't fit, the answer is the same. We can't get to it. We can't sample it. We can't open it. The evidence stays sealed. Now here's where it gets stranger. Because von Fries and his colleagues didn't just see a crater shape. Look at what the gravity signature actually describes: a dense, high-mass core sitting inside a ring, buried under ice in a spot no one can reach. That is a description of a location. It is not a description of what the object is. And when the man who analyzed the raw data was asked what could produce a mass reading like that, one of the possibilities he raised was a dense metallic body deep below the surface. A crater from an iron-rich asteroid is one way to get that. It is not the only way, and that is exactly the ambiguity that has kept this feature quietly controversial for almost 20 years. If you want to know why a place with this much buried evidence is also one of the hardest places on Earth to actually investigate, hit subscribe, because this channel goes into the sealed sites and the shutdown expeditions every single week, and Antarctica is the biggest sealed site of them all. Because the anomaly is only the first piece. The second piece is the ice above it and who is allowed to fly over it. Antarctica is not a free continent. People assume it's a lawless, frozen wilderness where anyone with a boat can go exploring. It is the opposite. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. On paper, the treaty is beautiful. It demilitarizes the continent, it bans weapons testing, it dedicates the whole landmass to peaceful science and international cooperation. It is often held up as one of the great achievements of the Cold War, a place the superpowers agreed to leave alone. But read the timing. The treaty was signed in 1959. Just 12 years after the single largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica had come and gone. And in the decades since, the continent has become one of the most access-controlled places on the planet. Today, private pilots and independent explorers who try to reach the interior are turned back. In June 2025, a young pilot named Ethan Guo landed a small plane on King George Island and was detained and eventually forced to leave, charged under the machinery that governs who is allowed where on the ice. Others who have flown near the continent have reported being shadowed, warned off, escorted away. The official reasons are safety and environmental protection, and those reasons are real. Antarctica will kill an unprepared person in hours. The environment is fragile. Search and rescue is nearly impossible in the interior. All true. But notice what the rules produce, whatever their intent. A continent the size of the United States and Mexico combined, where the only people who get to see the interior are the ones cleared by national programs. And where a gravity anomaly the size of a country sits under the ice, with no independent expedition allowed to go drill it. And the enforcement is not gentle. The treaty is backed by real hardware. The waters and skies around the continent are watched by radar, by Coast Guard vessels, and when a situation calls for it, by military aircraft. The original 12 nations that signed in 1959 have grown to nearly 50. Whole zones are effectively closed to anyone outside an official program. You cannot simply charter a plane and go look at the interior of Wilkes Land. The system was built, we are told, to protect the ice and the science. But it also functions as something else. It is a filter that decides who is allowed to see what is under there. And so far, the answer for the largest buried anomaly on the continent has been almost no one. For decades, one detail kept surfacing in the accounts of people who actually flew missions down there: magnetic anomalies, zones where instruments behaved strangely, where compasses and navigation gear didn't read true. Pilots described being told to avoid certain areas. Now, magnetic anomalies are a real and ordinary feature of Antarctic geology. The bedrock is full of iron-rich volcanic rock that scrambles a compass. That is the boring explanation, and it is probably the right one most of the time. But it is worth sitting with the fact that the same continent, hiding a 300-kilometer dense mass in its gravity field, is also a continent where the magnetic field itself refuses to behave, and where the people flying over it were told there were places they should not go. That's the second piece. A locked continent, a treaty signed right after a military expedition, and anomalies in the very forces we use to navigate. Now we get to the piece that started all of it: the one no one has ever fully explained. In late 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump. It was staggering in scale. Nearly 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. It was commanded, in part, by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most famous polar explorer in America, a national hero. Officially, it was called the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, Task Force 68. And officially, its purpose was training, testing men and equipment in extreme cold, mapping the coastline, establishing a research base called Little America IV. Here is what doesn't sit right. You do not send the largest naval and air force in the history of Antarctic exploration, thousands of combat-ready men, and dozens of warplanes to practice being cold. And the mission, planned to run for months, wrapped up and went home after only about 8 weeks. Task Force 68 departed the ice far earlier than its own stated timeline. Participants later described the operation as disorganized, said they were confused about their objectives, said it felt like something other than what they'd been told. And then there is Byrd himself. After the expedition, Byrd gave statements, quoted in the press of the era, warning that the United States needed to take measures against hostile aircraft that could fly over the polar regions and strike from the top and bottom of the world. Skeptics have a clean explanation for that line, and it's a fair one. In 1947, the enemy that could come over the pole was the Soviet Union, and Byrd was talking about the coming Cold War. That is almost certainly what he meant. But the words got out. Aircraft. From the poles. And in the decades since, that quote has fueled an entire underground of stories about what high jump actually encountered down there. I want to be honest with you here, because this is where the story splits. Does any of this prove there are UFOs under the Antarctic ice? No, it does not. And you should be careful with anyone who tells you it's settled. Byrd's warning was about the Soviets. The magnetic anomalies are real geology. Operation High Jump ended early for a very human reason. That operating a huge fleet in Antarctic pack ice in 1947 was brutally difficult. Ships were damaged, one aircraft crashed and killed 3 men. And the Navy learned that the cost of holding the continent with 1940s technology was almost impossible. That is the grounded explanation, and it is well documented. And the Wilkes Land anomaly is most likely an impact crater or a deep geological structure, not a machine. The dense mass is the kind of thing you get when a mantle plug rebounds after a massive impact. Real physics, real geology. No aliens required. But even the grounded version is extraordinary. Even if every mundane explanation is correct, look at what's left standing. There is a buried structure the size of a nation under the East Antarctic ice, dense enough to bend gravity, that we have never once sampled. There is a continent locked behind a treaty signed on the heels of the largest military expedition ever sent there. And that expedition, led by a national hero, came home early, its men confused about what it was for, its commander warning about aircraft over the pole. Every single piece has an ordinary explanation, and not one of those ordinary explanations has ever been confirmed by putting a drill or a camera or a human being on the thing itself. And if the anomaly really is a giant impact structure, then it means an object big enough to reshape the planet struck the Earth and left almost no trace we can see. Hidden under ice so completely that we needed satellites measuring gravity from orbit just to notice it was there. It would mean our record of the great catastrophes in Earth's history is missing a chapter, and that chapter is buried at the bottom of the world where almost no one is allowed to look. And if it is something stranger than an impact, then we may never know, because the one place on Earth that hides the most is also the one place we've agreed to leave sealed. Think about that pattern one more time. Every time we reach toward Antarctica's interior, we find something we can't quite name, and then the reaching stops. The gravity anomaly was measured and never drilled. The magnetic zones were flown over and avoided. The expedition was launched and pulled back. The continent was mapped and then locked. Tonight, while the rest of the world sleeps, the ice sheet over Wilkes Land will keep doing what it has done for millions of years. It will sit in the dark, a mile thick, over a dense, buried mass the size of a country, 300 kilometers of something that bends the gravity of a planet and has never once been touched by human hands. The satellites still feel it. The pilots still route around the anomalies. The treaty is still in force. And the largest buried structure of its kind on Earth is still down there, still sealed, still waiting for someone to be allowed to go and find out what it is. If you want to know what else the ice is hiding and why the door keeps closing every time we get close, watch the next investigation on screen right now.